Joining me today is two other members of the research team, as Rick mentioned, Dr. Salim Sheikh and Dr. Nancy Hoder, who have also been involved in this process since the inception about 5 years ago. As Eric mentioned, we discussed one of the two big research questions that we were addressed to look at last time, and that was producer revenues. That was presented in the March meeting. I think we went over a lot of material in that presentation because there was a lot of stuff that goes into understanding how that study was designed and what the outcomes of that were. Part of what we're doing today is an offshoot of that. We're going to focus on prevent plant. I'm hoping that the presentation today will be much shorter than it was the last meeting, and that we'll have an opportunity for questions and comments. And while we included the revenues, lost revenues to producers if they were forced into a prevent plant situation as a result of the diversion, the revenues were included, but we didn't really articulate or define the acreage or, for that matter, the inputs that would not be purchased as a result of that. So the analysis that we're talking about today really has a focus on the egg supply sector and really what the addition of having more PP in the staging area would mean for those businesses that are actively supplying inputs to producers that are operating in that area. We have a generalized set of producer decisions that are part of the modeling that we're doing. Obviously, this is a complex set of decisions that every producer goes through. The economics of those decisions vary by producer, vary based on insurance provisions and such. But in general, producers go through a period where they can obtain optimal yields if they can get the crop planted in a certain point in time in the spring. Then as they progress outside of that window, their yields will start to decline. Ultimately, they come to a point in the planting period where they have to make a decision on whether they want to continue to plant the crop that they're planting at a substantially increased yield loss, or switch that crop to another crop that is more suited to being planted at that point in time, or claim PP meaning prevent plant. And so we have dates in the analysis that correspond with federal crop insurance provisions, and they're specific to the region that we're dealing with. So we don't have a distribution around all kinds of what ifs with producer decisions. We're forcing all the decisions on PP and switching crops to follow the same set of guidelines. So just a little backdrop on where we're coming from with what we pulled together for this study. All of the output that we're using here comes from the simulation modeling that was covered in fairly good detail in the last meeting. We did add a database that looks at input costs from actual producer records. That's important. That data is not an estimate, but actual production records. And we're really looking at probably showing you three sets of output today. Acreage of prevent plant that the diversion is contributing to, the value of those production inputs that would not be purchased on those lands, and changes in crop volume coming out of the staging area. So this slide looks busy. Basically, all it is to simplify the analysis and eliminate a lot of the tweaking that would go with this or that type of a adjustment. Essentially, if any part of the staging area is flooded, we're assuming it's all flooded. We didn't include land rent in this analysis. We figured that is something that would be uniquely negotiated between tenants and landowners. We didn't account for any pre-purchase of inputs prior to the spring planting season. No weed control or cover crop requirements on the prevent plant acres. Those expenses would, of course, offset some of the lost inputs if the land did not get planted to a crop. We're not including any of the acreage that's lost to the diversion infrastructure. That's another issue that we, of course, did not address here. There's one storage area in this staging area that we excluded. And that has to do with the hydrology. The big issue that is hard to quantify is the crop insurance sales that would be foregone within the staging area, and the sales that would be lost on acres that cannot be planted. Suffice to say, there's a lot of eligibility issues here that we're uncertain of. There's a lot of coverage issues. So we took a very limited look at this. Obviously, this is an issue that will probably be revisited when and if the provisions for that type of coverage become better defined. So we have three scenarios with this analysis. The baseline is the treatment that you guys received last month, and that means that corn and wheat acres not planted by May 31st, that's our switch date, 20% of those acres would become PP and 80% would be switched to soybean. The reason for some of that being PP is we recognize not all lands are going to be available to plant at that switch date, and in some cases, some lands would not be suitable for planting to soybean. All the sugar beet acres get planted, so we're not dealing with that. There's no switch crop for soybeans. Soybean acres not planted by June 10 go to PP, and that's according to federal crop insurance guidelines. If we look at the scenario 2 and scenario 3, we enter into a little more pessimistic framing of this question. We're assuming there's no switch crop for corn and wheat. So if they don't get it planted by May 31st, it all goes to PP. So that's the difference between 1 and 2. And then 3 is kind of a worst case scenario where there's no switch crop for corn and wheat. All of those acres go to PP. And if it's too risky for producers to try to raise sugar beets on those lands that are flooded, we're modeling that sugar beet acreage to be displaced someplace else, and corn and soybeans would be raised on those acres. And those acres would be treated just like all the other corn and soybean acres. So that being said, we've got 3 conditions. We're going to focus on the condition 2 and 3 in the results. So if we look at prevent plant acreage, what you see here is we have the 10 flood sizes that we're evaluating, and we went over that in fairly strong detail a month ago. And then we have a 25th percentile worst case and a 5% worst case. These are based on the number of simulations that we ran with the modeling that we developed. And you can see here that when we get to the larger floods is when we start seeing a noticeable increase in the amount of PP acreage that's caused by the diversion. Not to be mistaken with the total amount of PP, because that's a different issue, and we're only looking at on the margin how much additional acreage is created by the operation of the staging area. Relatively low amounts of acreage, and these numbers here are very consistent with what we talked about a month ago regarding kind of the lining up of when the lands would be ready to plant and when the effects of flooding are largely over. So translating those acres into lost crop production inputs, this is from the perspective of the ag supply people, the businesses that are providing fertilizer, chemical, seed, some custom work. A lot of it comes from your local elevators and dedicated firms. Here you can see that on the scale here of the amount of dollars that are foregone, that producers are not going to purchase as a result of not being able to plant those acres. We see the big spike again as we get to those bigger, longer, deeper, stronger, bigger floods, but not so much with the smaller floods. And that again is going to be directly linked back to what we're finding out with the acreage. So what's the way that we can put this into context and try to figure out, we know the dollar amounts, but is that a lot? Is it not a lot? If we looked at the staging area, and let's just say that it was corn, wheat, and soybeans, we're going to exclude the discussion for sugar beets because they're going to get planted. Because most of those acres are under contract, so those inputs will be purchased. So if we assume that it was just those three crops for all those acres, we're looking at 18 to 20 million in input purchases to put those crops in the ground and for the expenses that go with harvesting and raising a crop for a full season. The worst case scenario is that we're looking at about 400,000 in lost inputs. That's about 2% of the total inputs that would be purchased from lands in the staging area. One of the things that we're trying to help people understand is that if the crops are switched, there is a slight trade-off there between, for example, corn and soybeans, but the inputs that you would have purchased for corn now get substituted for soybeans, and that's why in that first scenario that we identified, we're really not seeing much at all of any consequence to lost inputs in that scenario. But of course, the numbers start increasing when we eliminate the ability to switch crops. So looking at the range of lost production, this has a bearing for your local elevators, grain handling systems. We didn't estimate a margin for those crops, but those firms can look at this and take a feel for that themselves. But we can see that there is a sensitivity between the 10-day dry down and the 14-day dry down. That's something we discussed last month, that is showing up. You can see here the number of bushels, anywhere from less than 50,000 up to 300,000, depending on the scenario. And you can kind of see the sensitivity on some of these floods when we go from the top 25th percentile worst cases to the 5% worst cases. That we're seeing a little more responsiveness in the model there to the amount of grain that's not going to get produced in the staging area. So what's the relative effect of that? Can we put that into context? If we eliminated sugar beets again to make this a simpler, more conceptually consistent analysis, we're looking at about 5.7 million bushels. That would be corn, wheat, and soybeans coming from the staging area using current yields, assuming no major planting delays. This is a absent of the diversion type of condition. The amount of grain production that's going to be foregone, and that's a combination of lands that are prevented from being planted and yield reductions on lands that are delayed. So it's a combination of both those factors. Anywhere from 20 to 100,000 bushels. Again, that's a 0.5 to about a 2% change in the amount of grain volume coming out of the staging area. When we look at worst case conditions, we're upping that by several factors, but even at that point, 300,000 bushels, we're looking at a reduction of 5 to 6%. Again, this is only due to the diversion. We know that there will be additional reductions in flood years, but remember that we're identifying just what we think is attributable to the diversion. So here's maybe more in line with what I'm suggesting with that concept this is actual prevent plant acreage for corn. The blue bars are Cass and Richland County in North Dakota. The orange bars are Clay and Wilkin. And you can see here that this is the percent of land dedicated to that crop acreage in the county. In other words, what's the crop rotation percentage? It's based on how many total acres there are, and then what share of those acres didn't get planted. You can see that we don't need to know what the share of corn is. I think it's around 40% or 35% in the counties. Lots of acres that didn't get planted in those flood years of 2009 through 2011. Another condition in 2014, and another large condition last year. And then you can see here what the average is. So suffice to say, large flood years are going to produce a lot more PP than what we're modeling, only because of the way that we're looking at measuring it. We're just looking at the additional incremental amount that comes from the diversion. This is the same graph looking at soybeans. And again, this would make a lot of sense. Soybeans are planted much later in the season. Producers are willing to put those in, at a point when the yield reductions are less severe, less of a decline than they would with other crops. So if the producers are in a position where they don't have PP insurance, or alternatively, if the economics for that producer favor planting another crop, those are factors that will adjust these. But even looking at that, we have very small amounts of acreage dedicated to soybeans that don't get planted. And in the PP provisions there, most of that would not get planted is due to moisture. We're not looking at other claims to crop insurance losses. So summarize, and then we can open this up to some questions and discussion. I did not want to do a repeat of the lengthy presentation last time. I wanted everyone to have a chance to kind of weigh in. Under average spring planting conditions, really the diversion is not producing a substantial increase in PP. In the worst 5% of those simulations, when we look at a 500-year flood, that's a very low probability of occurring. We see, an additional 1,000 acres of PP coming in as a result of the diversion. In those most diverse conditions, I think it's suffice to say we could start talking at the 2% level and go up and down from there. And there's a larger range of effects on grain volumes because we're again including not just the lands that are prevented from growing a crop, but lands that are growing that have yield reductions because they were put in late. And so that is kind of a neat and tidy little summary of the PP analysis. We have a full report that's available that details in far more scrutiny than we put in here. I do have all of the slides appended that we went over last time. If there is issues that we brought up in the previous presentation that people have a question on or something, we have all the materials available. And I guess we hopefully between the 3 team members, we can answer any questions you guys might have.
Well, great. Thank you so much. Who's got a question? Roger, have you got anything you'd like to throw into the mix?
Well, I think it's very, very complete, Dean. Your team has, I think, captured what I wanted to see from a farmer standpoint, and really a little surprising that that we're not seeing a bigger percentage of losses, but we have to rely on the inputs that were put into your models and believe those.
I think one of the concerns there, Roger, is that we've limited this analysis to a 14-day dry down period, and if there are going to be conditions when perhaps that's not realistic, that would evidently push those lands further into the spring, and we might see an increase. Unfortunately, we can't model that as a number that varies like we did the other ones. If we go to a slide that we presented before, we're really still working with this particular environment here where these 2 periods really coincide pretty closely. And if we want to see a bigger influence of the diversion, we have to have conditions that either extend the flood further into the spring or things that change when the producers can get in the field. And that's driven by the data. And so right now, what we're seeing is a very strong result from the data we have. If that data changes, we of course would potentially have a much different set of conclusions.
Dean, could you explain the 25-year flood and why that's showing a little more impact than maybe even the 100-year?
Yes. One of the conditions that we modeled with the hydrology data is the duration of the flood. In other words, how long the flood actually lasts, as opposed to the overall peak magnitude of water. And the 25-year extra long flood is more synonymous with the 1997 flood. And as a result, that was a flood that, we didn't see peak flows like we did in 2009, but what we did see was we saw flows that were large enough to operate the diversion for several weeks. So in that case, the 25-year long and 25-year extra long is representative of a change in the duration of the flood and not the overall size or peak flow.
See, this is Eric. Maybe just one more comment on that. Obviously, every flood is unique, and we've all been through several of them. But looking at the hydrograph from the 97 flood, it's quite a bit different than most of our flood events. And that different shape of the hydrograph, I think, is what's being pointed out here in that 25-year EL, meaning extra long, which was again modeled after the 97 flood. And so, that goes to show that the duration of the flood have some impact on planting dates, of course. But keep in mind that the hydrograph for the 2009 flood was, while every flood is unique, the 2009 flood was sort of extraordinarily unique because of the shape of the hydrograph.
One additional clarification on that, Eric, is that we did go back to the hydrology modelers and say that, are the results that we're seeing from our modeling consistent with the hydrology that was present in 2009? I think most of us had the memory of a rather quick and high peak in Fargo, but the hydrology shows that there was actually a second peak, a second crest that came through. And for some of the lands, that kept the producers out of the field based on the way we were modeling, and that extended that opportunity to plant way into the spring. And so we're seeing, more meaningful impacts with a 2009-like flood because of that second crest. And that's again, a unique hydrology-based factor in the modeling. And so if we have a flood of any size where we have a quick flush and then we have another subsequent surge that comes later, we'll see much larger effects from a flood like that than we would a flood that goes through builds up and then drops down and then everything else gets a chance to dry out.
So isn't that more typical though, to have that second crest? Am I mistaken?
Well, I think that's a question for the engineers and the hydrologists, and those that are, studying those issues. To what extent that second crest is going to be a prevalent problem, how often that occurs. That if we look at the flow data, there are in some cases crests, or I should say, points in time when the floodwaters go down and come back up. But there was only the one flood where when the waters came back up that they were high enough to keep the diversion staging area active. And so some of that is a function of, how much of a second increase are we seeing? And then at what point in the spring did that second increase show up?
And then I know we've had some conversation about June events or summer events. Was that analyzed in this particular case or not? I would think that my guess would be that it would be kind of a moot point, but I'm just wondering where you're at with that.
Well, there's obviously the possibility that a sequence of unforeseen events in June or July would result in perhaps the need to use the diversion. That hasn't occurred historically yet. We did not model that, but my understanding is, and maybe members of the land committee or Eric could weigh in on this, is that there have been acknowledged that there would be a provision put forth for the producers that if the staging area was operated in the summertime after the crop was planted, that would be handled on a case-by-case basis. We don't have any data to model that. It's never happened before, but the hydrologists tell us that just because it hasn't happened doesn't mean it can't. So it is something worth noting. It's of course not anything that we modeled with this effort.
Dean, this is Roger again. I do have a question about the impact of on your data of if 1 acre gets backed up water on it from the diversion, the whole staging area was considered used. How does that impact the data?
Well, the data that we got from the hydrologists broke the movement of water in terms of when it showed up and when it went down by staging area. But when they model the staging area, the water shows up in a lot of these cases, does not encompass the entire storage area. So if we were to use only actual acres that were inundated and not the storage area, we would have a smaller footprint. However, the problem with that is that you and I both know that ownership among those staging areas or those storage areas could be multiple landowners, and we don't know if that affects one producer or affects all the producers, or if that affects access to land that cannot be accessed that's ready to plant. And so without a lot of more complicating type of detail, it was the safest, most conservative estimate to say, if you had some flooding on that storage area, we're going to assume all of that land is not ready to plant. In reality, that may or may not be true, depending, of course, on the natural topography of the land, the size of the flood. If all of the land's owned by one landowner or multiple landowners, all that factors into all those variations that could take place.
So in effect, it's actually was conservative actually in giving maybe more or higher level of damage because more acres were considered to be flooded?
Well, if we were to assume that all of the unflooded land could be planted, that would probably be true. But we know that there are going to be cases where 2/3 of a field is planted and the farmer's not going to want to try to go in and plant a small portion of that until the rest of the field can get dried out. There are those producer decisions that we can't account for. Access to that storage area, maybe the access to that field is underwater and parts of the other field isn't. It is a more conservative approach, but without having definitive boundaries within the storage area to identify those tracts of land that could be accessed by another producer that isn't going to wait for the rest of his land to dry out, it's really hard to separate that out. Now, the hydrologists can model and show the level of inundation for each of those storage areas for each of those floods. And so in some cases, yes, the tracts of land on the outside boundary of where the water is inundated would be those that would be the most suspect to that particular question. But all of those tracts that are subsequently fully inundated, that would become a moot point.
All right, Mary. Thank you, Dean.
Thanks, Roger. Does anyone else have any questions, and especially anyone that's engaged in crop production? Jenny or John, anyone have anything that they'd like clarified? Or Eric, if you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, this is Eric. I guess the only thing I might just add, and perhaps this was mentioned previously, but I'll share it again. The base study that Dean and his team presented last month was something that the Diversion Authority had asked NDSU to produce originally back several years ago. And the most recent version, of course, was updated to reflect today's project and the information that we know about the project today. Today's presentation on the prevent plant risk was an additional study effort that we asked the NDSU team to analyze in response to comments and questions from the co-op businesses that operate in the staging area. They had some concerns about the potential for a sort of massive prevent plant risk, and obviously that would impact the producers, but not only the producers, it would impact the ag businesses that make a business or make their living by selling fertilizer and selling seed, and then also hauling grain that gets harvested. And so this study was really done in response to those comments and questions and concerns. And so hopefully that we're finding that we're trying to be responsive to those concerns and bring forward some factual information that can help answer the questions and concerns.
I think, Eric, one thing driving that concern is if you look at this chart again, over the last 9 years, we've experienced during flood years a substantial amount of acreage that has been PP. So from the input suppliers perspective, they're already up against a difficult situation each time it floods. We have a number of lands that do not get planted. These, of course, are county-wide numbers. The staging area is a relatively small portion of the overall size of these counties, but looking at these numbers, these translate into thousands and thousands of acres of PP when you look at it across the 4 county areas. So their concern is justified that, would the diversion make an already difficult situation much worse?
Very good. Nancy or Salim, do you have anything that you'd like to add?
No, I don't. I think Dean, got her through and got her on time. So,
Salim, what about you? Okay. Well, thank you very much, Dean and Salim and Nancy. Really appreciate all your hard efforts on this. Great presentation, and as we mentioned, as Eric mentioned, this will be on our website to take a deeper dive and share with others if you care to. So thank you so much.